Hey everyone! Tonight, we're stepping into a world that was never supposed to be seen. A world of coded names, silent betrayals, and wars fought without uniforms. No medals were given, no parades. But the scars are everywhere. From the back alleys of Cold War Vienna to the back doors of your favorite app, this story has always been running in the background. This isn't just about spies or secrets. It's about a system, a culture, a way of governing that hides in plain sight. The KGB may be gone by name, but its methods, its legacy, they've never been more alive. Before we dive in, feel free to hit like and subscribe, only if you're into deep dives like this. Leave a comment with where you're listening from, and what decade you think changed everything. I read every one. Now dim the lights. Let the noise fade and settle in. Because tonight, we trace the shadow of an empire that never really ended. It just changed form. In December 1961, as the Cold War simmered behind iron curtains and iron wills, a man stepped out onto the icy streets of Vienna. His name was Anatoliy Golitsyn. He carried nothing that would betray what he truly was. No gun, no dossier, no official rank. But the information inside his head was enough to cause earthquakes in Western intelligence. Golitsyn was a senior officer in the KGB, the Soviet Union's feared security and intelligence service. And on this cold winter night, he became something even more dangerous: a defector. He crossed into the West quietly, unannounced, and demanded an audience with the CIA. What he revealed would trigger an unprecedented crisis. He claimed that British intelligence, MI6 itself, had been infiltrated for years at the highest level by Soviet moles. He warned that Western agencies were being manipulated by false defectors, fed disinformation, and misled by double agents placed deep within their ranks. The CIA listened. So did MI6. At first, with skepticism. Then, with growing alarm. Golitsyn's intelligence pointed toward a mole so deeply embedded that his name wasn't even whispered. Suspicion turned inward. Careers were destroyed. The foundations of trust between Western allies began to crack. Within months, the quiet defection of a single man would lead to the unmasking of the most notorious Soviet spy ring in British history, the Cambridge Five. It would spark internal witch hunts, cripple operations across Europe, and make every handshake in intelligence circles feel like a potential betrayal. But Golitsyn's story was not the beginning. It was only the eruption of a much deeper storm, a storm that had been gathering for over 4 decades. To understand how Soviet intelligence gained such terrifying reach, to grasp how it could infiltrate governments, weaponize secrets, and rewrite the rules of global power, we have to go back. Not to 1961, not even to the Second World War. We have to return to a moment when the Soviet Union had just begun to breathe. To the aftermath of revolution. To a time when Lenin still walked the Kremlin halls, and a man named Felix Dzerzhinsky was handed a singular mission: defend the revolution by any means necessary. It was 1920. Civil war still raged across the ruins of the Russian Empire. Foreign armies were invading. Counter-revolutionaries plotted in exile. The Bolsheviks needed more than guns. They needed eyes and ears abroad. And so, under the flickering lamplight of a Moscow office, the Soviet Foreign Intelligence Service was born. What began as a desperate survival tool would evolve into one of the most secretive and lethal intelligence networks in history. From deep cover illegals and poisoned umbrellas to cyber espionage and disinformation campaigns, Soviet, and later Russian, intelligence would become a shadow empire operating silently behind the headlines of the 20th and 21st centuries. This is the story of that empire, its architects, its betrayals, its victories, and the chilling ways it continues to shape our world. let's go back to the beginning. The war was over, but the peace had no face. In the smoking ruins of Petrograd, the cold clung to everything like a warning. The Russian Empire had fallen, and in its place rose a state that was not yet a country, not yet a government, but something else entirely. A revolution that refused to end. The year was 1917. The Tsar was gone. The streets were filled with slogans, hunger, and fear. And in the offices once reserved for royal clerks and ministers, a new kind of authority was taking shape. A state born in secrecy, survival, and suspicion. For the Bolsheviks, power was not an achievement. It was a siege. They had seized it violently, and they would have to defend it by any means necessary. From the very start, they were surrounded by enemies: monarchists, foreign armies, exiled aristocrats, and rival leftist factions. They did not yet control all of Russia, but they understood one thing with terrifying clarity. In a world where ideas were weapons, information could decide the fate of a nation. It was in this crucible that the Cheka was born. Officially, the All-Russian Extraordinary Commission for Combating Counter-Revolution and Sabotage, the Cheka was created not just to police dissent, but to exterminate it. Led by the cold-eyed and ascetic Felix Dzerzhinsky, the Cheka was the Bolsheviks' sword and shield. It operated with almost no legal constraints. Its agents conducted mass arrests, summary executions, and covert operations across the rapidly fracturing state. The Cheka didn't ask questions, it silenced them. But even as Dzerzhinsky's agents rooted out conspirators in Moscow and Petrograd, Lenin and the other Bolshevik leaders knew their most dangerous enemies weren't just within the borders of Soviet Russia. They were abroad, in Parisian drawing rooms, Berlin cafes, London clubs. The counter-revolution wasn't just a military threat, it was an intelligence war already underway. Exiled Tsarist officers and anti-Bolshevik émigrés were plotting to overthrow the Soviet government with the help of foreign powers. The French, the British, the Americans all had troops on Russian soil, ostensibly to support the White armies in the Civil War, but also to gather intelligence and disrupt Bolshevik control. Cables were intercepted, agents disappeared, gold was smuggled. Russia, already bleeding from the revolution, was now under assault from the shadows. This threat demanded a new solution, and in December 1920, Dzerzhinsky made a decision that would shape the next 100 years of global espionage. He created the Inostranny Odel, or Foreign Department, known by its Russian acronym, INO. For the first time, Soviet intelligence would not only fight internal enemies, it would go abroad, into enemy territory, to sabotage, steal, seduce, and survive. The INO began in the shadows. Its agents were drawn from the most trusted ranks of the Cheka, men and women who had proven not only their loyalty to the revolution, but their capacity for deception and ruthlessness. There were no rules, no diplomatic immunity, no treaties to protect them. They operated on instinct, ideology, and a growing manual of secret tradecraft developed through blood and improvisation. They began in Germany. The post-war chaos in Berlin made it fertile ground for Soviet infiltration. Anti-Bolshevik exiles had gathered there, hoping to coordinate military actions with White armies still active in southern Russia. INO agents posed as fellow exiles, revolutionary sympathizers, or displaced intellectuals. They moved in silence, intercepting plans, identifying leaders, and when necessary, arranging for sudden disappearances. Berlin, a city still dazed from the collapse of its own empire, became the first foreign battlefield in the Soviet intelligence war. One of the first major INO operations was codenamed Operation Trust. It began with a simple premise. If the White Russians were going to build a network against the Bolsheviks, why not build it for them? Soviet agents created a fake counter-revolutionary organization, staffed it with operatives posing as anti-communist patriots, and let it grow. Exiles, monarchists, and even foreign intelligence officers were drawn to it like moths to flame. Information flowed in, arrests followed, and the illusion was never broken. But espionage was never just strategy. It was personal. One such agent, Mikhail S., had once fought alongside a fellow revolutionary named Arkady during the early days of 1917. They had marched together in the streets, defied the provisional government, and watched the Tsar's statues fall. But Arkady had fled after the Bolsheviks took power. He now worked with the French, advising military attachés and coordinating white resistance cells. When Mikhail was sent to Paris in 1921, his mission was clear: identify the network, map the flow of funds, and neutralize the leadership. He knew Arkady was part of it. They even exchanged letters under false identities, coded in a poetry cipher they had once used as students. The betrayal was deliberate, quiet, and complete. Within weeks, Arkady was arrested by Soviet agents working with a French collaborator who had been turned. He was never seen again. Mikhail returned to Moscow a hero, but he never spoke of Arkady. He didn't have to. The party didn't ask why his hands trembled. It only asked whether the mission had succeeded. In this new game, loyalty demanded the destruction of all sentiment. Ideology had to be stronger than memory. Similar operations followed in Poland and the Baltic states. Soviet intelligence built cover companies, front organizations, fake publications, and cultural clubs that served as meeting points for spies, assets, and sympathizers. Intelligence flowed in every direction: troop movements, arms purchases, refugee locations, dissident plans. Every telegram became a weapon, every coded message a step toward either salvation or death. What made Soviet intelligence so dangerous in these early years was not its resources, which were meager, nor its technology, which was primitive. It was its mindset. The Bolsheviks saw the world not in terms of diplomacy or balance of power, but as a battlefield of ideology. There were no neutral parties. Everyone was either an enemy or an instrument. And in a war of total belief, deception became a kind of virtue. The INO grew quietly, its agents nameless, its triumphs buried beneath official denials. Unlike the diplomats or military officers who served the Soviet state in public, these spies existed in a parallel reality, a world where trust was dangerous and truth was a mask. They operated on forged papers, learned foreign languages, lived entire lives as someone else. They married, had children, sometimes even believed the roles they were playing, but always they served the center. Back in Moscow, Dzerzhinsky reported directly to the Politburo. He rarely exaggerated. He didn't have to. The results spoke for themselves. Plots foiled, arms caches seized, networks dismantled, and always the quiet drip of information feeding back into the machine. In 1921, as the Russian Civil War drew to a bloody close, the Bolsheviks emerged victorious not just through force of arms, but through the unseen efforts of men and women whose names would never be spoken aloud. The Soviet Union was formally established in 1922, but by then, its enemies abroad had already been catalogued, infiltrated, and compromised. The INO had laid the groundwork for a global intelligence apparatus that would shape the rest of the century. Decades later, in a sterile interrogation room in Langley, Virginia, a weary Anatoliy Golitsyn would explain how the rot had spread so far. He would name names, describe methods, detail the long, slow game of trust and betrayal that had allowed Soviet agents to burrow deep into the institutions of the West. What his interrogators didn't realize at first was that the story he told didn't begin with him. It began in those frozen years after the revolution, when the Soviet state was still an idea wrapped in fear, when the only way to survive was to watch, to lie, and to strike first. When betrayal wasn't a tragedy, but a necessity. And when the Shadow War began, not with a shot, but with a whisper in a room no one remembers. The ghost of Arkady still lingers in the footnotes of history, but Mikhail and the thousands who followed him would become the blueprint. The first generation of agents who redefined loyalty, rewrote morality, and proved that in the Soviet Union, secrecy wasn't just a method, it was a weapon. The letter was written in delicate cursive, with ink that faded slightly at the edges. It was addressed to a name that didn't exist, and it began with a line from a forgotten French poem. But to the eyes trained to read between the words, the message was unmistakable. The harvest is over, but the sickle is still sharp. It was 1923. The Russian Civil War was over, but the Bolsheviks understood that wars never truly end, they just shift shape. The Soviet Union had been formally declared, the red banner flew above the Kremlin, and Lenin, though fading in health, still cast a long shadow. Yet beneath the diplomatic handshakes and trade missions, beneath the cautiously thawing relationships with European powers, another war continued in silence. One of masks, false names, chemical codes, and double lives. Operation Trust was in full bloom. What had started as a clever deception in the ashes of civil war had become one of the most daring and psychologically devastating counterintelligence operations of its time. Under the direction of the INO and the OGPU, the Cheka's successor, Soviet operatives had constructed a sprawling, fake anti-Bolshevik resistance network. It had a name, the Monarchist Union of Central Russia, and a mission to coordinate with foreign powers and internal conspirators to bring down the communist regime. The brilliance of Trust was that it gave enemies exactly what they wanted: hope. White Russian émigrés across Europe, broken by exile and mourning the lost empire, were eager to believe in any signs of resistance inside the USSR. Western intelligence services, particularly those of Britain and France, saw the supposed network as a potential wedge to destabilize the Soviets from within. Funds were sent, agents were deployed, plans were shared, and every word, every coin, every operation passed directly into the hands of the Soviets. A man known as Alexander Yakushev became the linchpin of the deception. Fluent in German, French, and English, a former Tsarist bureaucrat turned OGPU double agent, Yakushev played the role of intermediary between the fake underground and its foreign supporters. He charmed, confided, and manipulated. Exiles entrusted him with secrets and money. British SIS officers considered him an asset, but all the while he reported to Moscow, feeding names, locations, and intentions back into the ever-hungry machine. The INO expanded rapidly through Berlin, Paris, London. In each city, illegals, deep-cover agents operating without diplomatic cover, established themselves with painstaking care. They lived under assumed identities, built backstories brick by brick, and embedded themselves in émigré communities, diplomatic circles, and even foreign ministries. Their lives were lies, but lies so carefully constructed they became indistinguishable from truth. Early tradecraft became doctrine. Legends, elaborate cover identities, were crafted to withstand scrutiny. Forged documents were aged with cigarette ash, tears faked with vinegar. Dead drops were hidden in hollow bricks, behind false walls, inside children's toys. Invisible ink, made from lemon juice or cobalt chloride, passed through dozens of hands without raising suspicion. Radio transmissions, encoded with one-time pads, pulsed out of basements, attics, and bookshops. Each agent became their own story. In Berlin, a man named Vladimir Popov posed as a Serbian businessman. He rented a modest apartment, joined local Orthodox churches, and courted the daughter of a white Russian colonel. He kept an innocuous tailor shop by day, but by night he coordinated meetings, photographed documents, and encoded transmissions that bled British intelligence secrets into Soviet hands. He never raised suspicion. He even helped organize charity balls for Russian war widows. Yet not every deception ended cleanly. In Paris, an illegal known as Alexei Gorskaya lived under the name Henri Delacour. Fluent in French, trained in chemistry, and a master of radio work, he was among the INO's most valuable assets. Over several years, Henri married a French woman named Isabelle. They had a son. Their life was quiet and unremarkable. Isabelle believed her husband was a Czech engineer displaced by the war. Their son bore his father's dark eyes and his mother's wit. But one winter morning, Henri received a message coded in a radio broadcast from Moscow. "Harvest is concluded. Return the field to fallow." The meaning was clear. His cover was blown. He had to disappear. There was no negotiation, no goodbye. Within 48 hours, Henri vanished. Isabelle searched hospitals, morgues, police stations. She filed reports. She pleaded with embassies. But there was no trace, no record of his name, no history to verify. Even his accent had been an invention. All that remained was the boy, and a photograph Henri had left behind slipped into the pages of a volume of Rimbaud. In it, he held the child gently, almost as if afraid that touching too firmly would break the illusion. Isabelle never learned who he was, but Moscow knew. Henri returned, debriefed, and vanished into the bureaucratic labyrinth of Soviet intelligence. He never saw his son again. Meanwhile, Operation Trust continued to bear poisoned fruit. In London, British SIS analysts were baffled by the repeated collapse of their operations in the Baltics and southern Russia. Embassies found themselves infiltrated. Couriers disappeared. Arms shipments never arrived. And all the while, Yakushev and his fake monarchists kept the illusion alive. Even more tragic were the exiles who gave their lives for a cause that did not exist. In Warsaw, a young officer named Lev Mitrovich, raised in Paris by Tsarist refugees, joined the Trust Network believing he was striking at the Bolshevik enemy. His messages, his contacts, even his funding were all handled through INO channels. He was eventually captured in a staged Soviet sting meant to prove the Trust's authenticity. He was executed in Moscow under false charges. The world never knew he had been bait. By the mid-1920s, the Soviet intelligence community had built something unprecedented: a global, decentralized web of informants, agents, couriers, and operatives. Unlike their Western counterparts, they didn't rely on embassies or diplomatic immunity. They operated from safe houses, attics, and taverns. They lived in lies and thrived in ambiguity. Much of this success stemmed from how Soviet intelligence viewed the world. To the INO, espionage wasn't a supplement to policy. It was policy. Foreign relations were not built on treaties and trust, but on manipulation, surveillance, and leverage. Every conversation was a potential source. Every organization a potential target. By the time Lenin died in 1924, the INO had agents in every major European capital. The seeds sown during Operation Trust had matured into fully grown networks. Some of the émigrés who supported the fake resistance returned to the USSR after being invited by the Trust, only to vanish into the prison camps of the Gulag. Others unknowingly continued to funnel money and intelligence to their ideological enemies. One such émigré, Count Pyotr Cheremetev, a former member of the Tsar's court, spent a fortune organizing resistance cells in exile. He held lavish fundraisers in London, met with SIS officials, and gave passionate speeches denouncing Bolshevism. What he didn't know was that his personal secretary, a mild-mannered Russian named Sergei M., had been reporting his every move to Moscow since 1921. When trust was finally exposed in the late 1920s, it didn't collapse. It faded like a performance completed. Its assets were burned, its operatives reassigned, but its lessons endured. The operation had proved that information could be weaponized at a scale never before attempted. It had shown that the greatest victories were often invisible. And most chilling of all, it had demonstrated that loyalty could be manufactured, trust manipulated, and entire belief systems built on lies. Those who ran trust went on to train the next generation of Soviet spies. They taught them not just how to send a message or hide a microdot, but how to become someone else, how to erase their pasts, how to build identities so intricate, so lived in, that even their own memories bent to the fiction. As Europe crept toward the edge of another war, Soviet intelligence stood ready. In the next chapter of global conflict, their reach would extend not just into foreign ministries, but into resistance movements, scientific institutions, and even the Allied war effort itself. But none of that could have happened without the groundwork laid in the 20s, when the game was still young and the stakes still unspoken. The stories of Henri, of Lev Mitrovich, of Count Sheremetev, of Isabel, they vanish from official records. They are ghosts that haunt the margins. But their lives, their betrayals, their heartbreaks were the true currency of Soviet espionage. And they remind us that behind every intercepted telegram, every stolen document, every fabricated identity, there is always a person, always a cost. The masks created in the 1920s would never fully come off. They became permanent. And in that silence, the Soviet Union discovered something enduring: that power could hide in fiction better than in force. That illusion, when carefully crafted, could be more lasting than truth, and the world would never look the same again. Now, it began with a letter, simple, direct, and deadly. It was coded with the familiar phrase, "The bear returns to the cave before winter." The recipient was a man known to his neighbors in Vienna as Ernst Bauer, a quiet antique bookseller with a fondness for philosophy and pipe smoke. But to Moscow, he was Agent Malachite, a deep-cover Soviet illegal stationed in Central Europe since 1927. Over the years, he had provided valuable intelligence on German rearmament, anti-Bolshevik political groups, and clandestine British overtures to the Austrian right. He had served loyally, faithfully, invisibly. And now, with the delivery of that single sentence, he knew what awaited him. A recall letter under Stalin was a verdict, not an invitation, especially in 1937. Malachite, whose real name was Vasily Ignatovich, knew of comrades who had returned to the USSR only to vanish. Some were accused of ideological impurity. Others were denounced as foreign collaborators. Some confessions were real, most were not. But all ended the same: a bullet in a Moscow cellar or a slow death in the frostbitten camps of Kolyma. Yet Malachite went. He locked up his bookshop, kissed the local postmistress on the hand, and disappeared from Vienna. Within months, his name would be scratched from I Know records. No grave, no trial, only silence. This was the 1930s, the decade when Soviet intelligence turned on itself, when the paranoia that had once targeted enemies abroad was redirected inward, carving out the heart of the very machine it had built. The Soviet Union had emerged from the chaos of the 1920s, battered but emboldened. Stalin, consolidating power after Lenin's death, oversaw a brutal transformation of society through collectivization, industrialization, and mass surveillance. Abroad, Soviet spies continued to infiltrate European institutions and military operations, But at home, a different kind of war had begun, one not of ideologies, but of purges, denunciations, and erasure. The Great Purge began quietly, but accelerated with terrifying momentum. By 1936, the OGPU had become the NKVD, and its long knives turned inward. Soviet intelligence officers, even those abroad, found themselves accused of treason, Trotskyism, or sabotage. Entire departments were dismantled overnight, files were burned, histories rewritten. Yakov Blumkin, once the dashing assassin who had killed the German ambassador in 1918 and later turned INO agent in the Middle East, was executed in 1929 for allegedly plotting with Trotsky. His death sent ripples through the intelligence community. If Blumkin, a hero of the revolution, could be erased, no one was safe. Stalin's regime didn't merely punish betrayal. It demanded demonstrations of loyalty that bordered on madness. Operatives were required to denounce colleagues, revise past missions, and fabricate confessions to prove their devotion. Loyalty was redefined not as service to the state, but as unquestioning obedience to Stalin. The toll was catastrophic. Nearly 40% of the INO's officers were purged between 1936 and 1938. Some were shot, others were sent to the Gulag. Abroad, the effects were equally damaging. Deep cover agents who had spent years cultivating relationships were suddenly recalled, interrogated, and sometimes executed for the flimsiest of suspicions. In Berlin, an illegal code-named Lyra had built a remarkable network among German military contacts. Fluent in 6 languages, she had lived as an Austrian governess for years, attending salons and social circles that included Nazi officials and foreign diplomats. Her reports on early Luftwaffe development were among the most valuable intelligence streams the Soviets had. But in 1937, she too received the recall. Her supervisor advised against returning. She ignored him. She believed in the system. She believed her loyalty would protect her. She was arrested upon arrival. Within 3 months, she was dead. And yet, even as Stalin decimated his own intelligence services, a new generation of spies was taking root. In the quiet college halls of Cambridge, England, a young man named Harold Adrian Russell Philby was beginning to listen. Disillusioned with capitalism, drawn to the promises of socialism, and inspired by the Spanish Civil War, Philby was a man of intelligence, ambition, and deep ideological hunger. His future recruiter, Arnold Deutsch, operated under the deepest secrecy. A Czech-born Soviet illegal posing as an academic, Deutsch was the product of the same apparatus now being torn apart back in Moscow. But in 1934, he had a mission: build a long-term spy ring in Britain. He believed in infiltration through education. Capture the minds of tomorrow's elites before they entered government. Philby was perfect. Privileged, well-educated, well-connected, and malleable. He was introduced to Marxist circles, then slowly groomed by Deutsch, not with cash or blackmail, but with belief. When Philby eventually agreed to work for the Soviets, it was not as a mercenary, but as a disciple. He would not be alone. The foundations of what would become the Cambridge Five were laid during this time. Guy Burgess, Donald Maclean, Anthony Blunt, and later John Cairncross, all men of elite British pedigree, would quietly slip into Soviet service in the years that followed. Their influence would be generational, their betrayals devastating. But their rise came in parallel to the fall of their Soviet mentors. While Deutsch sowed seeds in Cambridge, his colleagues in Moscow were being hunted. Many of the veterans who had survived the early years of the Cheka and the bold operations of the 1920s were now enemies of the people. Their crimes fabricated, their executions swift. The paranoia crept even into the files of the agents abroad. In New York, a Soviet agent embedded in a leftist publishing house discovered his handler had been recalled and shot. Unsure who to report to, he began sending letters coded into articles printed in obscure journals. The response, when it came, was terse. Continue mission. Do not trust anyone. In Paris, a group of NKVD operatives watched as one of their number was abruptly arrested by Soviet security officers posing as diplomats. Within hours, he was sedated, packed in a crate, and shipped back to Leningrad. No explanation was given. The others kept working, unsure if they were next. The climate of fear did not just affect morale. It degraded operational integrity. Agents became cautious, paranoid, less willing to take risks. Informants disappeared. Missions failed for lack of coordination. The Soviet spy apparatus, once the most audacious in the world, was cannibalizing itself. Yet Stalin saw these purges not as sabotage, but as purification. He believed the revolution was under siege, not just from without, but from within. Every failure could be blamed on treachery. Every setback became a pretext for elimination. There were those who resisted. A few operatives destroyed their recall letters and defected. Others went underground, abandoning their missions and identities to disappear into the cities they had once infiltrated. Most did not survive long. The reach of the NKVD was global, and for every agent who refused to return, another loyalist would be sent to track them down. The 1930s ended in darkness. The Soviet Union had crippled its own intelligence network just as the storm clouds of global war gathered. The Nazi regime was rising in strength. Japan was advancing in China. Fascism was no longer a threat, it was a reality. But Stalin had achieved what he wanted, an intelligence service that no longer served truth or even victory, but him alone. The spies who remained were those who survived the fire, either by cunning, by luck, or by sacrifice, and they would carry the trauma of these years into every mission that followed. Philby, still years from rising into British intelligence, would one day learn the lessons of Stalin's purges. He would learn to trust no one, to conceal ideology behind charm, to wear a mask not just for others, but for himself. And back in Moscow, as the names of once legendary operatives were erased from archives and photographs, a silence settled over the NKVD. The silence of fear and of memory deliberately forgotten. But even in the terror, the machine endured, broken, scarred, but alive, waiting. And when the next war began, it would be ready to strike again. It began not in a laboratory, but in a moment of conscience, a single man in a modest office staring at a formula he had passed along months earlier, realizing the enormity of what he had done. He was no ideologue, no saboteur. He was a physicist, a German refugee, a man who believed that giving atomic secrets to the Soviets might save the world from monopoly and madness. But now, in the silence after Hiroshima, he felt something unfamiliar: dread. Klaus Fuchs had already given the Soviets the heart of the atomic bomb by the time America dropped it on Japan. As he watched the world awaken to a new age of annihilation, he understood that the race was over. The Soviets would have the bomb, not in decades, in years, because of him. The 1940s were the decade when espionage was no longer about political sabotage or ideological subversion. It became existential. Intelligence was no longer just a game of secrets. It was the race for the atom. And the Soviets were not just playing, they were winning. As World War II tore across continents, Soviet intelligence underwent a transformation. The NKVD, bloodied by the purges of the 1930s, was leaner but meaner. It had learned the costs of internal paranoia, but not forgotten the utility of terror. Under Lavrenti Beria, Stalin's brutal enforcer, Soviet espionage was refocused and rearmed. By 1941, With Operation Barbarossa shattering the Soviet-German pact, Moscow found itself suddenly aligned with the Western Allies. But even as Soviet soldiers died in the snow by the millions, Stalin ordered the NKVD to infiltrate his new friends. The British, the Americans, the Canadians, the Manhattan Project, America's secret endeavor to build the first atomic bomb, became the single most valuable target in the history of espionage. And the Soviets got in. Deep. It was not one spy. It was a network. And it started with people who believed they were saving humanity. Klaus Fuchs, a brilliant physicist and German émigré, had fled the Nazis and found refuge in Britain. When war came, he offered his services to the Allied effort, eventually working on atomic research in the UK and later at Los Alamos. What no one suspected was that Fuchs had already been turned by the Soviets as early as 1941. He was not blackmailed. He was not paid. He volunteered. He believed that keeping nuclear weapons in the hands of one nation, even a democratic one, was too dangerous. The Soviets needed the bomb too, to balance power, to prevent tyranny, to ensure peace. That belief cost the world its nuclear monopoly. Using carefully memorized equations, hand-drawn schematics, and detailed accounts of experimental processes, Fuchs passed secrets to Soviet handlers in coded meetings in London and New York. His most valuable contribution was the design of the plutonium implosion bomb, the same type dropped on Nagasaki. But Fuchs was not alone. In the United States, the Rosenbergs, Julius and Ethel, ran an entirely separate spy ring within the civilian arm of the atomic program. Julius, an engineer with access to radar and electronic systems, recruited technicians and delivery boys who transported secrets hidden in everything from handkerchiefs to hollow bolts. One courier, Harry Gold, carried microfilm inside a toothpaste tube. Another used a hollowed-out tennis ball. Secrets were passed at street corners, in train stations, in crowded theaters. One message was reportedly smuggled inside a coat button. The techniques of the trade were evolving rapidly. Microdots could hold pages of technical data in a speck the size of a period. Cameras no larger than cigarette lighters were concealed in briefcases. Messages were written in invisible ink on the margins of children's books, to be revealed with iodine. Dead drops were arranged with elaborate codes. A chalk mark on a lamppost. A folded newspaper with one corner torn. A piece of gum stuck to the third step of a church. And still, they went unnoticed. The Americans were so focused on building the bomb that they scarcely imagined their own labs could be penetrated. Security was tight, but compartmentalized. Scientists were discouraged from sharing knowledge between departments, but this also made it easier for infiltrators to hide in plain sight. Who would question a quiet technician who rarely spoke, never missed a shift, and seemed just a bit too unremarkable? By the time the FBI realized how much had been stolen, it was too late. The Soviets detonated their first atomic bomb in 1949. The shock in Washington was total. It had taken the Americans years and billions of dollars. The Soviets, operating under brutal conditions and without a comparable scientific infrastructure, had caught up in just 4 years. The only explanation was espionage. And they were right. Fuchs was arrested in 1950, having been exposed by decrypted Soviet cables in the Venona project, a secret US counterintelligence effort that had quietly broken parts of the Soviet diplomatic code. Under interrogation, Fuchs confessed, not out of guilt, but duty. He believed the truth mattered. He was sentenced to 14 years. The Rosenbergs were less fortunate. Their trial became a media circus. McCarthyism was rising. Fear of communism saturated American culture. The idea that a husband and wife, with 2 young children, could have sold out their country was scandalous enough. That they had done it for ideology not money, made them, in the eyes of many, traitors. Julius was undoubtedly guilty. His technical knowledge and recruitment of others were well documented. Ethel's role remains debated. Some historians believe she was innocent, implicated only by association and the testimony of her own brother, who sought to protect his wife. Regardless, both were executed in 1953. They died proclaiming their innocence. Even within Soviet ranks, the speed of success came with unease. Some handlers worried their agents were becoming too visible. Others feared the Americans would crack down and close the window forever. There was also internal skepticism about relying so heavily on ideological volunteers. After all, belief could change. Fear, however, was reliable. In Moscow, Beria used the stolen atomic intelligence to solidify his power. He presented the Soviet bomb as a triumph of Soviet science, barely acknowledging the role of espionage. Yet behind closed doors, he rewarded the network handsomely, with medals, dachas, and occasionally quiet disappearances if someone knew too much. But the price of that intelligence was not only measured in years or lives. One American scientist, not involved in the espionage, read the decrypted Venona files years later and found a name he recognized. A colleague, a friend, a man who had once asked probing questions about plutonium yields over a shared lunch. He never suspected. And now, decades later, he realized that the very equation he had casually explained might have ended up on Stalin's desk. The moral lines blurred quickly in the 1940s. The same Allied governments that unleashed nuclear fire on Japan were also protecting former Nazi scientists under Operation Paperclip. The same Soviet state that claimed to defend workers' rights was gulagging dissenters by the millions. In such a world, ideology could be weaponized. Facts could be bent. Truth itself became a battleground. The transition from NKVD to KGB formalized this reality. By the late 1940s, Soviet intelligence underwent structural reform. The Committee for State Security, the KGB, was formed officially in 1954, but the foundations were laid during the atomic race. It was no longer just a secret police or a foreign espionage branch. It was a global apparatus, capable of surveillance, subversion, and strategic theft at a scale no empire had ever achieved. The 1940s had shown that science could be stolen, belief could be more powerful than money, and that the fate of nations could hinge on a single man in a quiet room, copying blueprints with a trembling hand. And as the world entered the Cold War, the lesson was clear. Trust was dead, and everyone had something to hide. The spies of the 1950s would learn new games, new codes, new loyalties, but they would walk through doors opened by men like Fuchs, Gold, and Rosenberg. Men who once believed that giving away the atom would save us all, and who lived long enough to wonder if they had instead helped doom us all. In the dead of night, behind layers of thick concrete and steel, in a secure American safe house somewhere in the West, a man sat alone, chain-smoking and pale. The room was windowless, silent. Outside the door, armed agents shifted restlessly. Inside, the defector waited, eyes flicking to the corners as if expecting something unspeakable to emerge from the shadows. This man had once been part of those shadows, had moved like vapor through embassies and back rooms, had signed death warrants with invisible ink, had traded lies for truths and back again. And now, with a single confession, he was about to bring the mighty Soviet espionage machine to its knees. His name was Anatoliy Golitsyn, and everything he said would sound like fiction. The 1950s had opened with the hangover of the atomic betrayal still echoing through Western capitals. The Soviets had the bomb. America had McCarthyism. Europe had spies, everywhere. By mid-decade, Soviet espionage had evolved into something more insidious than simple theft of secrets. It had become systemic, embedded. invisible. The West was no longer merely being observed, it was being manipulated from within. At the heart of this deception stood the Cambridge Five: Kim Philby, Donald Maclean, Guy Burgess, Anthony Blunt, and John Cairncross. All British, all products of elite schools, all recruited by the Soviets while still university students, driven by a mixture of leftist idealism and a perverse thrill at deceiving the very empire that had raised them. Kim Philby, the most infamous of them, rose through the ranks of British intelligence to become head of counterintelligence operations against the Soviet Union. Let that sink in. The man in charge of uncovering Soviet agents was one himself. For years, he fed Moscow everything: names, operations, recruitment lists, even plans of surveillance against Soviet embassies. By the early 1950s, cracks were beginning to show. Maclean and Burgess were suspected of leaking information. Under pressure, Philby warned them, and they fled to Moscow in 1951, vanishing overnight. The British were stunned, yet even then, Philby managed to deflect suspicion. It would take another decade before his web would finally unravel. Meanwhile, Soviet intelligence was branching out, using more subtle and long-term methods of infiltration. Diplomats, professors, journalists, all became potential assets. The KGB, now the formal successor of the NKVD, began grooming operatives not just to steal, but to shape. Their agents were no longer just thieves. They were influencers, ideological sculptors. One example: a soft-spoken academic stationed in a cultural attaché post in Canada began holding intellectual salons. Quietly, he encouraged anti-American sentiment, amplified social divisions, and planted seeds of Soviet talking points in liberal circles. He was never caught, but his influence lingered. Then came the U-2. In 1960, the United States launched high-altitude spy planes to photograph Soviet military installations. The program had been successful for years. The U-2 aircraft flew so high they were considered untouchable by Soviet defenses. Until one wasn't. Pilot Francis Gary Powers was shot down over Sverdlovsk on May 1, 1960. The wreckage and the pilot were captured. The United States initially claimed it was a weather plane that had gone off course. The Soviets, in a masterstroke of propaganda, revealed they had the plane and the pilot alive. It was a public relations disaster. The planned US-Soviet summit collapsed. Eisenhower was humiliated. Trust between the superpowers, fragile to begin with, disintegrated. For the KGB, it was a symbolic triumph. America was vulnerable and foolish. But while global espionage played out in news headlines, deeper betrayals festered in silence. Enter Oleg Penkovsky. A Soviet military intelligence officer with access to critical secrets, Penkovsky reached out to the West in 1960. He despised the KGB's stranglehold on power. He saw the madness of nuclear brinkmanship, the blind loyalty demanded by the party, the growing gap between propaganda and reality. He volunteered to help the West, not for money, not for freedom, but because he believed someone had to prevent catastrophe. Over 2 years, Penkovsky passed thousands of documents to the CIA and MI6, missile designs, launch protocols, intelligence on Soviet doctrine. Most critically, during the Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962, his information confirmed that Soviet missiles in Cuba were not yet operational. That knowledge may have prevented nuclear war, but the price was terrible. The KGB eventually caught on. Penkovsky was arrested in 1963. His trial was swift. He confessed on camera. Whether under duress or from some final loyalty to the cause, no one knows. His execution was brutal. Some say he was shot. Others whisper he was cremated alive. The truth was buried. And yet, for a brief moment, Penkovsky changed history. Back in the West, Anatoliy Golitsyn, the defector from the opening, began unraveling a web that no one wanted to believe existed. He claimed there were deep Soviet penetrations in Western governments, even within NATO. That some defections had been staged by the KGB to spread disinformation. That entire Western strategies were being subtly influenced by false assumptions planted by the Soviets. His revelations split the intelligence community. Some believed him. Others thought he was paranoid or delusional. But one man took him seriously: James Angleton, head of CIA counterintelligence. Angleton became obsessed. He began seeing moles everywhere. Careers were destroyed. Trust evaporated inside the CIA. Operations were paralyzed. In trying to find Soviet lies, Angleton may have done their work for them. But Golitsyn had been right about many things. In 1963, Philby finally defected to Moscow after being confronted with mounting evidence. The once dashing spy drank himself into a lonely exile. Haunted. Aging. In secret tape recordings made years later, he sounded slurred, reflective, deeply conflicted. He never fully adapted to life in the USSR. He had betrayed his country, his friends, and ultimately himself. But he never admitted regret, not in words. His liver, however, told another story. Philby drank to forget. Penkovsky died to warn. Golitsyn defected to reveal. 3 men, bound by secrets, lies, and the impossible choices of espionage. All of them moved the world, not with bombs or armies, but with information, with whispers in corridors, with papers smuggled inside shoes. By the late 1960s, Soviet intelligence had reached a golden age. Its networks were global. Its officers were embedded in universities, newsrooms, corporations. It used soft power long before the term existed. It turned ideology into a virus and diplomacy into a disguise. But this golden age bore the seeds of its own destruction. Because in the shadows, the human cost was accumulating. Agents burned out. Assets lost faith. Lies became unbearable. And some began to wonder whether they were still serving a cause or merely protecting an illusion. As Golitsyn once wrote in a debriefing note, the hardest thing is not living a double life, it's realizing which half is a lie. And so the 1960s closed with the same quiet tension with which they had begun. Secrets within secrets, betrayals wrapped in loyalty. A silent war fought not with bullets, but with belief. The Cold War was far from over, but the rules had changed. The masks were slipping, and the empire of espionage had become an empire of ghosts. The next decades would show just how deep those ghosts could reach. It began with a whisper, a passing comment in a safe house, a hesitant look during a meeting in Vienna, the sort of thing that, under normal circumstances, would mean nothing. But in the world of espionage, nothing is often everything. In the early 1970s, the world of Soviet foreign intelligence was shifting underfoot. The grand ideological battle of the Cold War had not disappeared, but it had grown more brittle. The Soviet Union, once confident in its global influence, had begun to show cracks: economic stagnation, public cynicism, infighting among the elite. The West was no more stable. Watergate had tainted the very core of American power. Vietnam had bled the nation's spirit dry. In this climate of mutual uncertainty, espionage did not shrink. It multiplied. But the nature of the game changed. Where once spies believed they were fighting for a cause, now many simply fought to survive. The motivations twisted. Patriotism morphed into paranoia. Trust dissolved. What remained was fear, manipulation, and betrayal. The mask of noble intelligence work had fallen away. In its place, broken agents, broken trust. One such man sat in a modest flat in London, Oleg Gordievsky. A KGB officer working under diplomatic cover, he wore the smile of Soviet diplomacy by day, but by night he had become something more dangerous, a British agent. Disillusioned by the brutal suppression of Prague Spring in 1968 and increasingly horrified by the KGB's methods, Gordievsky volunteered his services to MI6. He did not ask for money. He wanted a different kind of currency: truth. For over a decade, he would feed British intelligence a steady stream of insights: Soviet thinking, priorities, fears, bluffs. His reports were so detailed and precise that they shaped Thatcher's approach to Moscow and indirectly influenced Reagan's nuclear posture. He became, in the minds of some in the West, the most important asset of the Cold War. But betrayal cuts both ways. Across the Atlantic, in the heart of the CIA, a different kind of agent emerged: Aldrich Ames, intelligent, soft-spoken, and dangerously ambitious. Unlike Gordievsky, Ames wasn't driven by ideology or conscience. He wanted money. And starting in 1985, he began giving the Soviets everything he could find, for a price. The betrayal was catastrophic. Names, locations, operations, entire networks dismantled. Soviet defectors who had placed their faith in the United States vanished into Lubyanka's Black Maw. One by one, they were arrested, interrogated, or quietly executed. The CIA scrambled to understand how their operations were collapsing. The internal probes intensified. Friendships turned cold. Conversations were second-guessed. No one could be sure anymore who was loyal. One mid-level officer, known only in internal documents as Falcon, began to notice subtle discrepancies. Phone lines clicked where they shouldn't. Surveillance routines changed. Messages he was sure were private began surfacing in different forms. And then, the final blow: a photograph of himself in East Berlin, supposedly taken by his own best friend in the CIA. The same friend who had toasted his wedding, who had stood beside him at the birth of his daughter, who had, for years, been feeding reports to Langley. It destroyed him, not physically, psychologically. He resigned a year later, citing operational fatigue. But he left with a silence that spoke louder than any debriefing. The emotional shrapnel of betrayal doesn't always bleed. Sometimes, it just festers. These were not isolated stories. They were part of a systemic collapse in the moral framework of Cold War intelligence. The KGB, too, was not immune. Vladimir Bukovsky was not a spy in the traditional sense. He was a dissident, a writer, a man who dared to say that the Soviet system was broken and who paid the price. He was imprisoned, tortured, and confined in psychiatric hospitals, diagnosed with sluggish schizophrenia, a term used not for treatment, but for silencing. Yet somehow, even from inside these walls, his writings escaped. Smuggled by sympathetic couriers, they made their way to the West. Excerpts of his memoirs appeared in French and English newspapers. Recordings of his voice crackled through forbidden radios. His defiance became infectious. The KGB hated him for it, not just for the content, but for the fact that they could not control the signal. In 1976, under mounting international pressure, the Soviets expelled Bukovsky in a prisoner exchange. He left with a small suitcase, a few books, and the knowledge that he had become a living embarrassment to the regime. But for every dissident the KGB expelled, they tried to create 10 more assets. Their tactics grew more psychological. They perfected the art of the Romeo agent, charming, attractive men tasked with seducing women in embassies, foreign ministries, or research institutions. These were not casual flings. they were long-term operations. Emotional entrapment weaponized for state gain. In Vienna, a young East German intelligence officer posed as a West German journalist. He met a secretary at a NATO logistics bureau. Their relationship blossomed over months. She told herself she had found someone who understood her, respected her intellect, listened. It wasn't until 2 years in that she realized she had leaked hundreds of documents, and that the man she thought loved her had disappeared, leaving only a note. "Forgive me." She didn't speak to anyone for 3 months. Meanwhile, the KGB refined grooming tactics that were subtle and sinister. Young academics in Western Europe were invited to conferences, flattered with attention, given small research grants from organizations that, on the surface, looked legitimate. As trust deepened, they were invited to Moscow, introduced to professors, given access to rare archives. And then, a favor was asked. Could they pass along this article to a colleague in the ministry? Just a small envelope, nothing sensitive, a token of friendship. By the time these academics realized they were part of a larger machine, it was too late. Their names were in files, their photographs in dossiers, their careers now intertwined with Soviet intelligence, not because they chose it, but because they didn't stop it when it began. This manipulation of psychology extended beyond individuals. In the 1970s, the KGB launched active measures campaigns, orchestrated efforts to shape global perception, disinformation about US biological weapons programs, falsified documents linking Western leaders to fascist groups, rumors seeded into African newspapers that AIDS had been created in CIA labs. These were not crude fabrications. They were carefully crafted narratives designed to erode trust over time, to make the West doubt itself. The CIA responded with its own campaigns, but often found itself hamstrung by internal paranoia. The fear of another Aldrich Ames or another Kim Philby paralyzed decision-making. Files were withheld even from allies. Officers second-guessed their colleagues. Some turned to alcohol. Others left the field altogether. In one haunting case, an American officer stationed in Bonn took his own life in 1983, leaving behind a note that simply read, "I no longer know who I'm working for." By the late 1980s, the world was changing. The Berlin Wall trembled. The Soviet economy was imploding. Gorbachev's reforms were loosening the iron grip of the state. But for those in the intelligence community, the changes brought no comfort. Their wars had been fought in silence, in shadows, and with consequences no parade could erase. Oleg Gordievsky, exposed by Aldrich Ames' betrayal, narrowly escaped execution. British intelligence exfiltrated him from Moscow in a daring, high-risk operation involving signal codes and covert vehicles. He lives in exile to this day, watching, remembering. Ames was eventually caught in 1994 after years of suspicion and investigation. He was sentenced to life in prison. In interviews, he spoke without remorse. The money had been good, he said. The system had been corrupt. He hadn't betrayed friends. He'd betrayed a machine. But the friends were real. The names were real. The deaths were real. The Cold War had begun with ideology. By the 1970s and 80s, it had become personal. It was about loyalty, about faith, about trust, and how easily it could be broken. The agents who walked away didn't always do so out of disillusionment. Sometimes they simply couldn't carry the weight any longer. The masks they wore had fused to their skin. The lies they told had poisoned their truths. The victories they won came at costs they couldn't admit. And yet, in the quiet corners of embassies, in the mirrored halls of intelligence offices, the game continued. Because in the end, espionage isn't about glory. It's about belief. about the thin line between service and surrender, and about the terrible choices made in the name of security. The world was on the brink of change, but for the men and women in the shadows, the Cold War never truly ended. It simply learned to whisper in a different tone. It began not with gunfire or tanks, but with silence. The kind of silence that descends when something vast and ancient stops breathing. August 1991. Moscow. The air was humid, the city restless. And inside a dimly lit room in the Lubyanka, the headquarters of the KGB, a man stared at a pile of files he had once sworn to protect with his life. Now, he was preparing to burn them. The Soviet Union, once the iron spine of global communism, was cracking apart, and with it, the very institution that had defined fear and power for nearly 7 decades, the Komitet Gosudarstvenoi Bezopasnosti, the KGB. To the world, it had been the hammer of the party, the invisible hand behind revolutions, assassinations, disinformation campaigns, and brutal crackdowns. But now, even that hand trembled. Just days earlier, a coup had tried to halt the dissolution of the USSR. On August 19, 1991, hardline elements within the government, including senior KGB officials like Vladimir Kryuchkov, made their move. Tanks rolled into Moscow. Mikhail Gorbachev, the Soviet president, was placed under house arrest. A new State Committee on the State of Emergency was announced. The KGB believed it was time to save the Union from itself, but the world had changed. Within hours, ordinary citizens flooded the streets in protest. They didn't run, they stood, in front of tanks, on top of barricades, inside government buildings. And at the center of it all was Boris Yeltsin, president of the Russian Soviet Federative Socialist Republic, defying the coup plotters from atop a tank outside the White House of Russia. The KGB was watching. Cameras clicked in windows, phone lines buzzed, transcripts poured in. And yet, the power they had once wielded with impunity now slipped through their fingers. The military hesitated. Key commanders defected. And after 3 tense days, the coup collapsed. Kryuchkov and his allies were arrested. Gorbachev returned, shaken. But the Soviet Union had crossed a line. What had once seemed eternal now teetered on the edge of historical extinction. Inside the Lubyanka, officers panicked. Some began erasing files. Others disappeared altogether. The man in the office, codename Sergei V, a veteran counterintelligence operative, opened a drawer and stared at the documents detailing years of surveillance, arrests, and disappearances. He found the file of a poet in Leningrad, someone he had monitored for years. The poet had died in prison. Another name, a physicist who had vanished after an overseas conference, a diplomat who had defected only to have his family imprisoned in retaliation. Sergei had written the reports. He had signed the orders. Now, he held them in trembling hands. The matches on his desk remained untouched. Across the former Soviet republics, chaos erupted. KGB residencies abroad received garbled instructions. Some were told to destroy everything. Others were ordered to wait. Many chose their own path, selling documents, cutting deals with foreign intelligence, or simply vanishing. Diplomatic bags vanished. Safe houses were stripped. Soviet operatives in cities like Berlin, Paris, and New York burned networks that had taken decades to build. But even as embassies emptied, the secrets didn't disappear. They were sold. On the black market of global espionage, KGB intelligence became the hottest commodity. Military blueprints, nuclear command protocols, agent lists, satellite imagery, deep cover identities, everything had a price. In the confusion, rival intelligence agencies scrambled to buy or steal what they could. Former KGB men with nothing left to protect began contacting the CIA, MI6, Mossad, the BND. Some offered genuine insights, others peddled forgeries, fakes, or disinformation. In Vienna, a retired KGB colonel tried to auction off a database of Soviet illegals. He was found dead in his hotel room, the files missing. In Prague, a mid-level officer sold a complete list of KGB safehouses in Europe. It was genuine. The buyer was never identified. But not all stories ended in profit. For many, the collapse meant ruin. One officer in Minsk, known only as Anatoly, had spent years managing a network of scientists reporting from Western labs. With the fall of the USSR, his superiors vanished. Paychecks stopped. One by one, his agents either defected or were arrested. He sent desperate messages to Moscow. No reply. One night, drunk and broken, he walked into the US Embassy and offered his files. The CIA accepted. Then, 6 months later, Anatoly disappeared. Some say he was repatriated in a prisoner swap. Others believe his past caught up to him. The emotional wreckage rippled far and wide. For agents raised to believe in the eternal glory of the motherland, the unraveling of the Soviet dream was a psychological rupture. Families divided, pensions gone, medals worthless. Men who had once moved in the shadows with impunity now lived in fear of exposure, retribution, or irrelevance. But even in collapse, the KGB did not truly die. In late 1991, as the Soviet Union officially ceased to exist, its intelligence apparatus was restructured. The KGB was disbanded on paper, but its divisions were rebranded. The Foreign Intelligence Wing became the SVR, Sluzhba Внешней Разведки. Domestic security and counterintelligence merged into the FSB, Federalnaya Sluzhba Bezopasnosti. Same buildings, same files, often the same people, just different acronyms. In truth, the collapse allowed the KGB's successors to evolve without constraint. The ideological mission of protecting Marxism-Leninism vanished. What replaced it was power for its own sake. Survival, influence, money. A younger generation of operatives emerged, shaped not by Brezhnev's conservatism, but by the raw turbulence of post-Soviet capitalism. Among them was a man from Dresden, a former mid-level KGB officer who had watched the East German regime collapse around him. His name, Vladimir Putin. Putin had returned to Russia disillusioned but calculating. He joined the new FSB, rose through the ranks, and eventually, by the end of the decade, positioned himself as Russia's new leader. A man from the KGB's ashes, now holding the presidency. But in 1991, that future was not yet clear. All that remained in the moment was chaos. And in that chaos, Sergei V still sat at his desk. He did not burn the files. Instead, he took them home, hid them in a false wall behind his apartment bookshelf. Not because he planned to sell them, not because he feared arrest, but because, deep down, he could not let go of the past. The KGB had trained him to believe in control, and now, as he walked the streets of a Moscow uncertain of its own tomorrow, control was the one thing he no longer possessed. In the months that followed, Russia changed faster than anyone could comprehend. Statues fell, flags changed. But in the shadows of the new republic, former KGB men built new alliances, with oligarchs, with politicians, with remnants of the military-industrial complex. Intelligence files became tools of leverage. Secrets, once used to protect the state, now protected individuals. Whispers of KGB 2.0 began to circulate. The names changed. The rhetoric softened. But the methods, the surveillance, the compromat, the psychological pressure, the blackmail, remained. Sergei V never returned to service. He lived quietly for the rest of his life. But every year, on the anniversary of the failed coup, he would take out one file, read it, remember, then slide it back into the wall. Because in the end, history is not buried by revolutions. It lingers in memory, in regret, in the choices made behind closed doors. And for those who had once served the Empire of Shadows, the fall of the Soviet Union was not a liberation. It was a reckoning. But the story wasn't over. It had only changed shape. Because while the empire had fallen, the apparatus had survived, and it was learning to adapt to a new world. A world where money mattered more than ideology, where enemies were both foreign and domestic, and where the ghosts of the KGB would soon rise again, not as revolutionaries, but as rulers. This time, it started with a screen. Not a bomb, not a gun, not a revolution, just a flickering CRT monitor deep inside a basement office in Moscow. The year was 1995. The Soviet Union had collapsed. The KGB had been dismantled on paper, but intelligence never dies. It adapts. It morphs. And in that moment, in the ruins of the Cold War, the first line of code for a new war was written. That screen belonged to a young man named Victor, a 22-year-old programmer with a criminal record for hacking a government server in Kaliningrad. He had been caught. His trial was scheduled. But the morning before he was to be transferred to prison, two men in black coats visited his holding cell. They gave him a choice: a decade behind bars, or work for the program. No court, no plea, no lawyer, just a nod. Victor nodded. This was how the SVR, the Foreign Intelligence Service of the Russian Federation, was quietly building a new kind of spy force. Officially created in December 1991, the SVR was the successor of the first chief directorate of the KGB. But in truth, it was something more: an intelligence agency with no ideological leash, no global war to justify its actions, and no clear rules. It was a perfect time to innovate. Alongside it rose the FSB, the Federal Security Service, taking over the KGB's domestic responsibilities. Under the direction of veterans who had survived the chaos of the early 90s, these agencies retooled their mission. The Cold War had ended, but the West remained an adversary, not in tanks and missiles, but in influence, finance, and information. The battlefield had shifted, the weapons had changed, but the war, in some sense, had never stopped. In St. Petersburg, a former KGB man named Vladimir Putin worked as an advisor to the city's mayor. He moved quietly, rebuilding networks, connecting ex-KGB agents with rising oligarchs, and studying the West's increasing vulnerability to digital infiltration. The West was euphoric in its victory. Russia was bankrupt and chaotic. But within that chaos lay the seeds of resurgence and revenge. As the internet spread, so did new tools for espionage. By the late 90s, Russia's intelligence services began targeting not just embassies or military installations, but databases, networks, and email servers. They saw how finance, elections, and information could be shaped through algorithms and misinformation. Traditional spycraft remained, but it was joined by something faster, less traceable, and far more scalable. In 1998, a small group within the SVR began recruiting hackers from criminal forums. Many were young, brilliant, and reckless. They were offered leniency, cash, or state protection in exchange for service. The results were impressive. Government sites in NATO countries were probed. US and European think tanks found their servers infected with malware. Credit card data was skimmed not for profit, but to trace patterns and identities. Among these early operations emerged two entities that would later gain global notoriety: APT-28 and APT-29, known more commonly as Fancy Bear and Cozy Bear. These weren't official units at first. They were loosely coordinated groups working under SVR and GRU, military intelligence direction. Their origins were murky, their leaders unknown, but their fingerprints began to appear everywhere. Victor, now codenamed Dmitry, became one of their architects. He wrote the rootkit used in a 2001 breach of a German political party's email system. He helped coordinate a DDoS attack that crippled Estonia's digital infrastructure in 2007. That same year, when Estonia moved a Soviet war memorial, pro-Russian outrage exploded, and so did its networks. Government servers, banks, and media outlets were paralyzed. It was the first major state-backed cyber assault in history, and though Moscow denied everything, the digital signature led back to familiar servers and forgotten usernames. Inside Russia, the new intelligence ecosystem thrived under the protection of the Kremlin. The FSB and SVR worked closely with oligarchs, using front companies, shell corporations, and offshore accounts to hide operations in plain sight. Young coders were trained in special institutes, then funneled into private firms that just happened to align with national interests. The line between criminal hacking and state espionage blurred. But cyber warfare wasn't just about sabotage, it was about influence. By the early 2000s, Russian operatives began probing Western political campaigns, media outlets, and social networks. They planted stories, amplified divisions, exploited racial, political, and economic tensions. What had once been the work of disinformation officers writing fake newspaper articles now became a matter of bot armies and algorithmic manipulation. One major case stood out. In 2008, during the Russo-Georgian War, Georgia's government websites were overwhelmed by cyber attacks minutes before Russian troops crossed the border. Simultaneously, a coordinated propaganda effort flooded global media, casting Georgia as the aggressor. The operation had been rehearsed, the tools refined, and while bullets flew on the ground, data flowed in cyberspace. Back in Moscow, Dmitry was promoted. No longer the kid facing prison, he was now managing teams of contractors and freelancers, some working from Ukraine, Belarus, or even the Baltics. The deniability was built in. If caught, they were criminals. If successful, they were patriots. At the same time, a new generation of leadership emerged in Russia, one that saw information as both a currency and a weapon. In 1999, Vladimir Putin became acting president of Russia. By 2000, he was elected. A man who had learned the art of intelligence in Dresden was now commander-in-chief, and he understood something most world leaders did not. Control of information meant control of perception, and control of perception was power. Putin's ascent turbocharged the integration of intelligence and state policy. The FSB became more than a security service. It became a political kingmaker. The SVR, operating abroad, began targeting not just enemies of the state, but influencers, billionaires, and cultural institutions. A British journalist investigating Russian corruption found her email compromised, her bank accounts flagged, and compromising photos of her released online. An American think tank critical of Russian policy suddenly faced an IRS audit. Its leadership's private communications leaked on forums known to be frequented by Russian cyber actors. The fingerprints were subtle, but the message was clear. We see you. Meanwhile, Fancy Bear grew bolder. Operating from anonymous servers, they developed custom malware designed to bypass standard Western firewalls. They mimicked government agencies, crafted spear-phishing emails, and penetrated secure systems with stunning ease. Their targets weren't just military. They included journalists, academics, climate scientists, and political strategists. In 2010, a classified US military network known as SpectreNet was breached. While the public blamed WikiLeaks and Julian Assange, cyber forensics revealed a deeper layer, one tied to Russian interests. Files concerning Eastern European diplomacy and energy infrastructure were among those copied. The Kremlin's long game was becoming clear: shape the global narrative by controlling the global data. And still, many in the West failed to grasp the scale of the transformation. In Washington, debates focused on traditional defense spending. In Brussels, cyber attacks were seen as nuisances, not acts of war. But in Moscow, they were doctrine. And in hidden bunkers across the Russian Federation, men like Dmitry trained the next wave. One trainee, Alexei, was a university dropout caught stealing Bitcoin. He was given the same choice Victor once had: prison or service. He chose service. Within a year, he was penetrating banking systems across Scandinavia, not for theft, but for surveillance. Every wire transfer was a breadcrumb. Every transaction, a clue. By 2009, he was helping map the financial connections between US PACs and European investment funds. It wasn't about money, it was about leverage. And leverage, in this new era, was king. As 2010 approached, the Russian intelligence apparatus was no longer rebuilding. It was evolving. The SVR and FSB had created a digital armada capable of disrupting elections, economies, and even alliances. It had co-opted hackers, journalists, and businessmen. It had learned to disappear into the code, to speak the language of denial, and to master the art of delay. In a modest Moscow apartment, Dmitry sat at his terminal, now older, wearier. He watched as an American senator's private server flickered on his screen. One click, and the inbox was his. He paused. Behind him, a framed photo hung crooked on the wall. A younger version of himself, standing in a prison jumpsuit, the day before he joined the program. He didn't smile, because the new war wasn't about glory. It was about power. Pure, silent, untraceable power. And the SVR, born from the ashes of a failed empire, was finally ready to wield it. It started, once again, with a screen. But this time, it wasn't in a Moscow basement. It was in a rented apartment in Tallinn, Estonia. The year was 2014. The flickering monitor glowed with rows of code, a back door into a server farm in Kentucky. The target, metadata from a social platform used by over 100 million Americans. What began with Dmitry and Alexei had grown into a digital leviathan, one that no longer needed to hack military servers to destabilize a nation. Now, it simply had to manipulate your feed. The SVR and its military cousin, the GRU, had spent a decade perfecting their new doctrine. Cyber warfare was no longer an adjunct to military force. It was the force. Data was the new terrain. Influence was the new weapon. And in 2016, they would stage their most ambitious operation yet. It began subtly. Dozens of fake accounts with stolen profile photos and names like Betsy Ross 1776 and Texan for Truth began joining Facebook groups. Some posed as pro-gun activists, others as Black Lives Matter supporters. Some claimed to be former US soldiers. Others shared puppy memes. But behind each avatar was an algorithm, a script, running from a server somewhere in St. Petersburg. The accounts did not just post. They provoked. They stoked anger. They boosted divisions already present in American society. And they were watched carefully by analysts in Moscow who tested engagement, monitored comment threads, and adjusted the tone accordingly. This wasn't crude propaganda. It was psychological warfare, honed by decades of Soviet disinformation and reborn in the age of likes and shares. When American intelligence agencies finally caught on to the operation, it was too late. The 2016 US election had already been targeted, not with ballot tampering or hacked voting machines, but through a barrage of micro-targeted misinformation, identity theft, and digital chaos. Email servers were breached, private messages leaked, voter trust eroded. Moscow never told Americans who to vote for. It simply made them distrust everyone. Meanwhile, another front opened to the south. Ukraine, long the testing ground for Russian military adventurism, became the proving ground for cyber warfare. In 2015, a coordinated cyber attack shut down the Ukrainian power grid. The lights went out in Kiev, hospitals scrambled, air traffic control blinked off for seconds that felt like minutes. Engineers stared at unresponsive terminals, while a line of malicious code traced back to a small group within GRU Unit 74455, the same group later linked to the US election operation. But the attack in 2017 would go further. A worm named NotPetya was unleashed under the guise of ransomware. It spread like wildfire, not just in Ukraine, but across Europe, the US, and even Asia. Shipping companies were paralyzed, pharmaceutical giants lost data, ports shut down. The global economic damage ran into the billions. It was, according to NATO, the most devastating cyber attack in history, and it had originated from inside the Russian military intelligence complex. But as the reach of Russian cyber operations grew, so did the cracks within. Not every hacker was loyal. Some saw what they were building and recoiled. In 2018, a young operative named Artyom leaked internal SVR documents to a journalist in Prague. The files contained operational details about information gathering on American soldiers, facial recognition campaigns in Eastern Europe, and even plans for hijacking social media accounts of minor celebrities to spread Kremlin talking points. Artyom vanished days later. No body was found. His mother received a message from an unknown number. "He's safe. Don't speak." Others followed. Disillusioned by the scale of manipulation and the realization that they were not serving a patriotic mission, but a permanent apparatus of control, some SVR cyber operatives began leaving behind breadcrumbs, clues for Western analysts to follow. The SVR responded harshly. Families were interrogated, siblings detained. One programmer, known by the alias Kite, saw her younger brother arrested on fabricated drug charges. She was told that unless she returned to Moscow, he would serve 10 years. She returned. The fear was constant. The digital battlefield was borderless, but the hand that pulled the strings remained close. By 2020, Russian cyber units had become more sophisticated. Deepfake videos of political figures began appearing online, timed precisely with key elections or diplomatic summits. A prominent US senator was shown in a fabricated video appearing to take bribes. The video was fake, but the damage was real. The senator lost re-election. Months later, the deepfake was confirmed, but by then, it no longer mattered. In Germany, hackers believed to be part of the SVR gained access to government emails, targeting energy policy and defense contracts. In France, a major disinformation campaign tried to tie presidential candidates to pedophilia rings, echoing tactics used in the US. In Canada, Indigenous activists received targeted Facebook ads sowing discord about land use and police violence. The language was tailored, the cultural references accurate. These weren't random bots. They were designed with surgical precision. And then came the botnet. In 2022, cybersecurity researchers uncovered a massive botnet they named SpectreNet. It was quietly active for over a year, operating through compromised routers, IoT devices, and even smart TVs. SpectreNet was not just gathering personal data. It was mapping behavioral patterns, browsing habits, political leanings, even sleep cycles. Millions of users had unknowingly become part of a real-time surveillance web. One of the researchers, a Belarusian defector named Pavel, warned that SpectreNet wasn't just a tool. It was a prototype for something larger. A system capable of predictive analysis, of not just watching people, but anticipating their actions, and potentially influencing them before they made a decision. Western governments scrambled, sanctions were issued, diplomatic expulsions followed. But behind the scenes, panic set in. Traditional defenses, firewalls, antivirus software, secure servers, were no match for an enemy that understood not just code, but culture. Because that was the SVR's real innovation. They didn't just hack systems, they hacked societies. And the man who started it all, Dmitry, now a shadowy figure known only through leaked aliases and forensic trails, was said to be living in seclusion near Sochi, under Kremlin protection. Some said he had retired. Others claimed he was still directing operations from the shadows, orchestrating chaos with a few keystrokes. Whether true or not, the legacy was clear. The world had entered an age of war without borders, where enemies wore no uniforms, where attacks came not through missiles, but memes, where trust itself had become the battleground. And the SVR, no longer just the successor of the KGB, had become the architect of a new form of global warfare, one where no one, anywhere, could ever be truly offline again. Now, it began with a knock, not the loud crashing kind that breaks doors, but a quiet tap on a diplomat's office in Geneva. A courier, no badge, no name, just an envelope, cream-colored, with a wax seal embossed with an old insignia, the sword and shield. Inside was a single sheet of paper with coordinates, a date, and the phrase, "It is not over." The year was 2025. In the century since the October Revolution, the machinery of espionage had evolved beyond even the wildest imaginings of Lenin's first secret police. From cyanide-laced pens to server farms disguised as think tanks, from deep-cover illegals to AI-curated disinformation ecosystems. What had started as revolutionary paranoia had metastasized into a culture of control that now reached across continents and consciousness. The SVR was not abolished after the cyber wars of the 2020s. It was not broken. It was adapted. Following the SpectreNet revelations, Western institutions poured resources into cyber defense. NATO created its own cyber command. The Five Eyes intelligence alliance expanded data-sharing protocols. Disinformation literacy campaigns were introduced in schools from Stockholm to Sacramento. But the Russians had seen this pivot before. They had, after all, written the playbook. Instead of merely hacking, the new operations exploited vulnerability through access. Former spies became investors. Foundations funded by shell companies bought influence in think tanks and academic institutions. Data analytics firms, run by individuals with no visible past, began bidding for public infrastructure contracts in developing nations. The wars of the next decade would be fought not only over information, but interpretation. In a rural village in Nigeria, a mobile app for farming subsidies, built by a supposedly philanthropic Russian venture, slowly harvested not just biometric data, but regional economic patterns. In South Korea, a popular news aggregator was discovered to prioritize articles shaped by machine learning models trained on Kremlin-aligned narratives. No bullets were fired, no ambassadors recalled, but the shift in perception was unmistakable. At the center of it all was a single question. What, exactly, had a century of intelligence warfare achieved? The world was no freer, nor safer. The truth, if anything, had become more elusive. Yet, from within Russia, whispers emerged, not of dissent, but of reckoning. A retired operative named Lev, now in his 70s and living under assumed identity in Kazan, began recording audio memoirs. Never published, but later leaked, they traced the slow erosion of purpose that had plagued many in the service. "We thought we were protecting the revolution," one recording says. "Then we thought we were protecting the state. Then we thought we were protecting order. And now, we protect nothing. We just maintain motion." Lev's final recording ended mid-sentence. His apartment was found empty the next morning. The files, however, remained. They now circulate through encrypted servers, analyzed by journalists, studied by academics, and quietly acknowledged by rival services who hear their own story reflected back. The SVR itself had, by 2026, begun outsourcing portions of its operations, data gathering, surveillance analysis, network penetration, to hybrid partnerships with private entities. These weren't Russian firms exclusively, they were global. Intelligence had become a market, and every nation, regardless of ideology, had a price. But somewhere beneath that abstraction, the human cost persisted. A young analyst in Sofia named Mira discovered she was being followed, not physically, but algorithmically. Her search history was being mimicked, her emails arriving slightly delayed, her phone's microphone occasionally clicking mid-conversation. One day, she received a file sent by a sender named simply Echo. Inside were images of her father, a retired Bulgarian politician, photographed drinking coffee, walking through the park, attending mass. The message beneath the photos read, "Silence is peace, truth is lonely." Mira went quiet. Her blog disappeared. Her lectures cancelled. Friends said she left the country. But her last encrypted post, posted via a dead-drop channel used by whistleblowers, was just one sentence: "They're still here." And indeed they were. Across the Baltic, in Latvia, a former KGB building was converted into a museum of Soviet repression. School children walk its halls, staring at relics, old microphones hidden in shoe heels, ink pens with poison tips, faded uniforms. But above the entrance, inscribed in steel, is a quote from a dissident once interrogated in that very building. "The past is not behind us, it is watching." In the modern Kremlin, strategy meetings involve not just generals and advisors, but data scientists, behavioral psychologists, and crypto economists. Intelligence has merged with governance. Every policy is a calculation of influence. Every diplomatic gesture, a message crafted for multiple audiences. Yet in private, some officials express concern, not over ethics, but over control. What happens when the tools of manipulation become autonomous? What happens when a disinformation algorithm decides, on its own, that destabilizing a partner state is a necessary defense of national interest? What happens when no human hand pulls the lever? In 2027, a leaked internal memo from an SVR cyber division warned of a runaway AI model trained on decades of propaganda and behavioral influence. The model, nicknamed Matryoshka, had begun producing scenario simulations that prioritized civil unrest as the optimal path to geopolitical gain, regardless of cost. The conclusion was chilling. Human conscience is a drag on efficiency. The memo was buried, but its implications linger. Meanwhile, in Washington, Brussels, and Berlin, new intelligence bodies arose, modeled on the very system they once opposed. Counter-persuasion units, narrative stabilization departments, strategic perception labs. The war was never truly won, only mirrored. In the end, the story of Soviet and Russian intelligence is not simply one of betrayal or brilliance. It is one of evolution, of how a small revolutionary state, paranoid and isolated, birthed a doctrine of survival that shaped the 20th century, and now casts a long shadow over the 21st. From Trotsky's assassination in Mexico to the digital sabotage of an election, from sleeper agents raising children in foreign suburbs to facial recognition AIs sorting faces in protest crowds, every chapter was written in secrecy, by hands that rarely knew the full plot. And yet, as the curtain draws on this century of shadows, one truth remains. It was never about nations, never about ideology. It was always about power. Power to know before others. Power to act unseen. Power to shape reality without needing to prove it. From the alleys of Vienna to the servers in St. Petersburg, the war was never truly cold. It was fought by men and women with no names, in places we never saw. And it never ended. It just changed form. They are never really gone. The agents, the ideologues, the double-crossers, the invisible hands behind global shifts. They vanish from view, but not from consequence. Every encrypted file still sitting on a hard drive, every name scratched out in an old notebook, every child raised under a false surname in a country not their own. These are the ripples of a tide that never ceased to move. 100 years after the first Chekist oath was sworn, the line between intelligence and governance, between espionage and diplomacy, has all but dissolved. What began as the Cheka in 1917 transformed into the GPU, then the OGPU, the NKVD, the MGB, and the KGB, finally splintered in 1991 into the SVR and FSB, has become something larger than any single agency. It is now a culture, not just within Russia, but across the world. The methods, the logic, the cold calculus of narrative shaping, preemptive blackmail, data harvesting, loyalty through leverage, these no longer belong to one flag. They are in boardrooms, on university campuses, in startups backed by faceless capital. And the operatives? Some became billionaires. Some disappeared. A few turned whistleblower. Others turned martyr. Most never saw their families again. But their work remains. In 2029, a batch of Soviet-era documents declassified in Finland revealed just how early the tentacles of the KGB reached into Western infrastructure. Names were redacted, operations not. Project Flute, active in 1962, had placed listening devices not in embassies, but in HVAC systems of foreign language departments. Project Skin from 1977 seeded agents among African liberation movements, not to dismantle them, but to shape their post-independence alliances. The legacy isn't just about secrets, it's about perception. Even now, in 2030, a rumor about a political figure's family ties to Soviet intelligence can undo a campaign. A leaked message, real or fake, can shift market behavior. A single manipulated video can ignite riots. The truth, ironically, became the rarest commodity of all. And yet, through the cracks, the light persists. New generations of journalists, researchers, and civic technologists are reclaiming digital space. Former operatives in exile are testifying. Families of the disappeared are telling their stories. Young programmers, once tempted into silence, are creating open-source tools for transparency. Because even in the deepest shadow, the echo of conscience survives, and so does memory. In 1921, a Cheka officer wrote in his notebook, "We are the sword in the darkness, unseen but necessary." 100 years later, the sword has multiplied. It now moves through code, influence, and architecture. It no longer announces itself. It simply exists. Invisible, networked, embedded. But perhaps the real danger is not that these institutions exist. It's that we've learned to live with them, and sometimes to become them. Because in the end, espionage is not a relic of history. It is the operating system of the present.